Hey viewers! Hope you're all doing great. Before I start the story, tell me in the comments which country you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you enjoy my videos, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. The Sleepy Revolution. How coffee changed Italy forever. In the hush of early morning, before the streets of Florence hum with footsteps, before Rome's fountains glisten under the sun, a familiar aroma drifts through the narrow alleys. Coffee. The dark, rich fragrance has become as much a part of Italy as its art, its churches, and its language. Yet, there was a time when this drink, now the soul of Italian life, was a foreign stranger, whispered about in merchant docks and secret chambers of learned men. This is the story of how coffee, the humble bean from distant lands, entered Italy, captured its spirit, and transformed its culture forever. It is a story that moves slowly, like a warm sip from a porcelain cup. Long before it reached the heart of Italy, coffee grew wild on the hills of Ethiopia. Shepherds noticed that their goats became restless after nibbling on the red berries of a certain shrub. This was no ordinary plant. From those African hills, coffee began its long voyage. From Ethiopia to Yemen, and from Yemen to the ports of the Ottoman Empire. By the 15th century, the drink had already begun to charm the cities of the East. Mecca, Cairo, and Constantinople. Its dark liquid became a symbol of conversation, intellect, and gentle wakefulness. But for Europeans, it was still an exotic mystery. It was the Venetian merchants who first carried whispers of coffee into Europe. Venice, the glittering republic that ruled the sea routes, had its hands in every trade: silk, spice, and silver. In the late 1500s, Venetian ships began docking at ports filled with sacks of strange, fragrant beans from the east. The smell was unlike anything Europeans had known. The first records of coffee arriving in Venice date back to around 1570. It came not as a luxury at first, but as a curiosity. Apothecaries, the pharmacists of the time, sold it as a medicinal drink, said to aid digestion and lift the spirits. Some called it the Arabian wine, though it contained no alcohol. As with many foreign things, coffee faced resistance. The Catholic Church, ever watchful over new habits, called it a bitter invention of Satan. The dark brew, coming from Muslim lands, raised questions. Was it sinful? Should Christians drink it? The turning point came in the early 1600s, when Pope Clement VIII was presented with a cup of coffee. He was urged by his advisors to ban it. But instead of condemning the drink, he tasted it. The story goes that the Pope smiled and declared, "This devil's drink is so delicious that it would be a pity to let the infidels have exclusive use of it." With that blessing, coffee was welcomed into Christendom. Venice soon became the first European city to officially import and sell coffee. At first, it was expensive, a luxury reserved for the wealthy and curious. But its fame grew quickly. By 1645, Venice opened its first café, a public coffeehouse where people could gather, talk, and dream. In those early Venetian cafés, the air was thick with tobacco smoke, perfume, and the murmurs of scholars and sailors. Men in long cloaks and powdered wigs gathered around small marble tables, discussing trade routes, poetry, and politics. The coffeehouse became more than a place to drink. It was a theater of conversation, a stage for ideas. And Italy, with its restless mind and love for words, found something in coffee that suited its temperament perfectly. Venetian cafés soon spread to other Italian cities: Turin, Genoa, Rome, Naples, and Florence. By the 18th century, each city had its own style. In Venice, cafés overlooked the canals, where gondolas glided under the moon. In Florence, they stood near the piazzas where artists painted and thinkers debated. In Rome, the cafés became silent witnesses to the whispers of priests and poets. One of the earliest and most famous was Café Florian, opened in 1720 in Venice's Piazza San Marco. Its gilded mirrors and velvet chairs became the gathering place of the elite, from writers to aristocrats, from Casanova to Lord Byron. Café Florian still stands today, its wooden floors echoing centuries of footsteps. As the Enlightenment spread across Europe, coffee houses became the pulse of change. In France, they hosted philosophers, In England, merchants. In Italy they hosted both, but with a distinctive flair. In the cafés of Milan and Turin, men debated not only science and art but freedom. Coffee sharpened their minds, kept them awake, and filled them with new energy. A sleepy revolution had begun, not through swords or banners, but through words and ideas exchanged over steaming cups. Italy's thinkers began to write, publish, and challenge authority. Newspapers and pamphlets were born on café tables. Poets found inspiration in the hum of conversation. The coffee cup became a silent companion of intellectual awakening. And though the rest of Europe was also changing, Italy's revolution was different. More personal, more poetic. The drink that once came from faraway deserts had found a home in marble cities, beneath frescoed ceilings and candlelit rooms. By the 1800s, coffee was no longer just for the noble or the learned. It became a habit of the people. Every morning, the scent of roasted beans filled the air from Palermo to Milan. Street vendors sold it from small carts. Housewives brewed it in copper pots. Workers sipped it before dawn. The café was no longer a luxury. It was a necessity. It was the pause between work and life, the rhythm of Italian time itself. When travelers passed through Italy, they noticed something different. The café was not merely a shop, it was a heartbeat. In other countries, people drank coffee quickly. In Italy, they lingered. They spoke. They thought. Coffee had changed Italy, but gently, like a whisper that becomes a song. As the 19th century unfolded, Italy was not yet the unified nation we know today. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and republics, each with its own rulers, customs, and languages. But among all those divisions, one habit was quietly uniting the people. Coffee. From the noble courts of Turin to the bustling markets of Naples, the same dark liquid steamed in porcelain cups, linking north and south, rich and poor. By the 1820s, coffee houses had become social institutions. They were where businessmen struck deals, artists debated beauty, and revolutionaries whispered about freedom. The Italian unification movement, Il Risorgimento, found some of its first breaths of rebellion within those quiet cafés. It was in places like Café Pedrocchi in Padua, known as the Café Without Doors, that students and intellectuals gathered to discuss Italy's future. Its marble halls echoed with secret meetings, political pamphlets, and dreams of independence. When revolutions broke out across Europe in 1848, coffee houses became informal headquarters for those who wished to end foreign rule. The smell of roasted beans mixed with the ink of printing presses, as ideas of liberty and nationhood spread like wildfire. Coffee, once a foreign import, had now become a symbol of Italian identity, a stimulant for the mind and for freedom itself. As Italy moved toward unification in 1861, the world around it was changing too. Steamships and railways carried goods faster than ever before. With them came new machines, new ways to roast, grind, and brew coffee. In the past, coffee beans were roasted in small pans over open fires, turned slowly by hand. But industrial progress brought larger roasters, uniform heat, and a consistency that transformed the trade. The growing middle class could now afford better quality beans. Italian entrepreneurs saw opportunity in every cup. Small family-run roasters began appearing in port cities, Trieste, Genoa, Livorno, importing raw beans from Brazil, Ethiopia, and Yemen. They roasted them locally, developing regional tastes and blends that reflected Italy's diverse culture. Trieste became one of the most important coffee ports in Europe. Its ships connected Italy to distant plantations, carrying sacks filled with green beans that would soon become the pride of the nation. The scent of coffee filled the warehouses along the Adriatic coast, a new kind of aroma that meant prosperity and progress. Something subtle but powerful began happening in these years. Italians didn't just drink coffee, they made it their own. In Naples, where life was noisy, colorful, and passionate, coffee took on a strong, bold flavor. It was thick and sweet, brewed in little metal pots called cacchiamel. In Milan and Turin, it was refined, elegant, served in glass cups in polished cafés. Each city began to shape its own coffee character. The act of drinking coffee became more than refreshment. It became ritual. In the morning, workers sipped a small cup before heading to the factory. In the afternoon, friends met at cafés to talk politics or poetry. In the evening, artists gathered under the glow of gas lamps, the sound of spoons stirring cups echoing through the marble rooms. By the late 19th century, coffee had reached into every corner of Italian life. It was the drink of the artist and the mason, the student and the soldier. It crossed class boundaries and blurred the lines between social ranks. In every Italian city, there was at least one café that felt like home. As the century turned, innovation once again reshaped the drink that had already changed Italy. Industrialization didn't just bring machines for roasting and grinding, it also brought pressure, literally. In 1884, a man named Angelo Moriondo of Turin filed a patent for a new steam machinery for the economic and instantaneous confection of coffee beverage. It was the world's first espresso machine, though the word espresso wasn't yet in common use. His invention forced hot water through coffee grounds using steam pressure, producing a faster, stronger brew. It was revolutionary. For centuries, coffee had been slow, ritualistic, something you brewed over time. Now it could be made in seconds. Moriondo's design was only the beginning. Over the next decades, inventors refined the concept, making machines more practical, more beautiful, and more powerful. By the early 1900s, the espresso had arrived, and with it, a new rhythm of life. The Italian worker, hurrying to the factory or office, could now stop at a bar for a quick, intense sip of energy. The word espresso meant pressed out, but it also carried a second meaning: express, or fast. Coffee had adapted once more to the heartbeat of the nation. By the dawn of the 20th century, Italy's cafés had evolved into cultural landmarks. They reflected the spirit of their cities and the dreams of their people. In Turin, Café Fiorio became the meeting place of politicians and thinkers. In Rome, Antico Café Greco, founded in 1760, continued to attract writers, musicians, and visiting artists. Its red velvet walls had heard the conversations of Goethe, Liszt, and Stendhal. In Milan, Café Cova and Camperino became symbols of fashion and modernity. But perhaps no city embodied the Italian coffee spirit more than Naples. There, the café was not just a building, it was a theater of life. The barista was part performer, part priest. He knew his customers, remembered their stories, and served coffee with ceremony. In Naples, coffee was art. The Neapolitans invented their own brewing devices and guarded their recipes as family secrets. One such invention, the Neapolitan flip pot, became iconic. A small metal brewer with two chambers that had to be flipped upside down mid-brew. The sound of its bubbling was music to Neapolitan ears. Coffee had ceased to be foreign. It had become as Italian as opera, as pasta, as the evening sun over the piazza. As Italy moved deeper into the 20th century, coffee became woven into its national identity. The same way the French spoke of wine or the English of tea, Italians spoke of coffee, with reverence and pride. It was served not with luxury, but with respect. A shared cup symbolized friendship, understanding, and belonging. Even in hardship, during wars and economic struggles, Italians found comfort in the small ritual of un café. Coffee had become Italy's quiet revolution, not loud or violent, but steady, aromatic, and deeply human. It was the drink that awakened the body, the mind, and the nation. When the First World War erupted in 1914, Italy found itself not only at the crossroads of Europe, but also in the midst of scarcity. Coffee, that once easy comfort, became a luxury again. Imports from distant lands slowed to a trickle. Ships that once carried fragrant beans from South America or Africa were now filled with weapons, soldiers, and supplies. In cafés that once overflowed with conversation, people now spoke in whispers. Coffee houses remained open, their lamps burning low, their walls lined with yellowed newspapers, but their cups were often filled with substitutes. Ground chicory, roasted barley, even acorns were used to imitate the dark taste of real coffee. Italians called it café di guerra, war coffee. It smelled familiar, but the soul of it was gone. Yet, even in these hard years, Italians refused to give up the ritual. In the early mornings before the factories opened, men still gathered in the bars. They still lifted their cups, even if what they drank was bitter and false, as a small salute to hope. After the war ended, the economy limped back to life. Real coffee began returning slowly through the ports, carried again by merchants who risked the seas. For many Italians, that first sip of real coffee after the war was unforgettable, the taste of peace, of normalcy, of life resuming. In the 1920s, as Mussolini's regime rose to power, coffee houses once again became spaces of quiet tension. The fascist government understood how powerful these gathering spots could be. They were not just cafés, they were places where people talked, questioned, remembered. To maintain control, the regime encouraged the creation of a new kind of establishment, the bar. Unlike the grand cafés of the past, these were smaller, humbler, and spread across every neighborhood. A bar was a place where a worker, a soldier, or a mother could stop for a quick espresso, a chat, or a pastry. The new bars reflected Mussolini's vision of a strong, disciplined Italy. Fast, modern, and efficient. But beneath the uniform surface, they also preserved something deeply Italian, the sense of connection. Even under strict political control, the barista still smiled, still served each customer by name. The espresso machine hissed like a small act of rebellion, steady, alive, and warm. The early espresso machines of the late 19th century had been clumsy and inconsistent. They used steam to push water through coffee grounds, often burning the brew and creating a bitter taste. But in the interwar years, Italian inventors sought to improve the craft. In 1933, a man named Achille Gaggia began experimenting with new designs. His idea was simple but revolutionary. Instead of using steam, use a lever-driven piston to force hot water through the coffee at higher pressure. This method would create a smoother, richer shot with a natural golden foam on top, the crema. By 1947, after years of refinement and war's end, Gaggia patented his machine. It marked the birth of the modern espresso as we know it. No longer a harsh, dark liquid, espresso now had body, aroma, and texture. It became art in a cup. Precise, measured, beautiful. When Gaggia's machines began to appear in post-war Italy, they drew crowds. People gathered not only for the taste but to watch the ritual. The pulling of the lever, the steam rising, the soft clink of porcelain. A new era of Italian coffee culture had begun. When the Second World War arrived, Italy once again faced the loss of coffee. Imports stopped entirely. The state rationed what little remained. But Italians, creative and resilient, continued to find ways to keep the ritual alive. Mothers roasted barley in their kitchens, filling the air with the faint, comforting scent of something close to coffee. Soldiers in the field received tins of instant substitutes. For many, the taste of coffee became a memory, something imagined rather than real. But that memory mattered. Even in bomb shelters, even under blacked-out skies, Italians dreamed of their morning espresso, of sitting in a quiet bar, of hearing the gentle murmur of cups. Coffee was more than a drink. It was a reminder of who they were, of everything that war could not destroy. When the war ended in 1945, Italy was weary, poor, and broken, but it was awake. And once again, the smell of coffee returned to its streets. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, as Italy rebuilt itself, coffee became a symbol of revival. Streets once filled with rubble now echoed with laughter and the hiss of espresso machines. Small bars reopened across every city. Some were no bigger than a single room. Just a counter, a machine, and a few stools. The barista became a neighborhood figure. Someone who listened to stories, comforted the tired, and served the first taste of morning. The espresso, quick and affordable, fit perfectly into the rhythm of the new Italy. It matched the optimism of a nation ready to move forward. A few coins could buy a small cup of joy. A café that reminded Italians they were still alive, still capable of beauty. In this period, great coffee brands were born. Illy, founded in Trieste in 1933 by Francesco Illy, grew rapidly after the war. Lavazza, started in Turin in the late 19th century, became a household name. Kimbo, Segafredo, and others followed. These companies turned coffee from a local tradition into a national industry, giving Italy not only taste but economic strength. By the 1950s, the espresso bar had replaced the old Grand Café. It was democratic, vibrant, alive. Office workers, students, and artists all stood side by side at the counter, sipping the same rich drink. Coffee had finally become what it was always meant to be in Italy: a shared heartbeat, a moment of equality. The Italian bar became more than just a place to drink coffee. It became the daily stage of life. The morning began with the clang of cups, the sound of newspapers unfolding, the rhythm of greetings. Buongiorno, un caffè per favor. Every neighborhood had its own bar, each with its own atmosphere. In the north, they were modern, polished, with chrome counters and sleek espresso machines. In the south, they were warmer, filled with chatter and laughter. Standing at the bar, not sitting, became a distinctly Italian ritual. Pause, drink, and go. It was quick, efficient, yet somehow deeply personal. By the mid-20th century, Italy had not only embraced coffee, it had defined it. The espresso was Italian. The bar was Italian. The rhythm of sipping, talking, and moving forward was Italian. From the ashes of war, a new identity had been brewed. Strong, fragrant, and full of life. In the years after the Second World War, something small and silver began to appear in Italian kitchens. An object that would forever change how coffee was made at home. It was the moka pot, invented in 1933 by an Italian engineer named Alfonso Bialetti. At first glance, it was simple. A small octagonal pot made of aluminum, with a sturdy handle and a sharp, purposeful design. But its brilliance lay inside. When placed on the stove, water in the lower chamber would boil, push through a funnel of coffee grounds, and rise as rich, aromatic liquid into the top chamber. The process was easy, elegant, and entirely Italian. For the first time, anyone could make strong, cafe-style coffee without leaving home. Housewives in tiny village kitchens and students in city apartments could now enjoy the same flavor that once belonged only to cafes and bars. The moka pot became a symbol of domestic pride. It appeared on every stove, sometimes stained and dented, always cherished. Morning began with the quiet hiss of boiling water and the slow, steady bubbling that signaled the brew was ready. By the 1950s, Bialetti's Mocha Express was in nearly every Italian home. It was affordable, durable, and beautiful. Its design became so iconic that it barely changed in decades. In a country rebuilding itself after hardship, the mocha pot represented something intimate and hopeful, the luxury of ordinary joy. As Italy entered the 1950s and 60s, its economy began to surge. The nation transformed from war-torn poverty to industrial power. Cities glowed with new lights, cars filled the streets, and optimism hummed through the air. And through all of it, coffee remained the pulse beneath the progress. The espresso bar thrived. Men in suits, women in heels, workers in overalls, all gathered at the same counter. Coffee was no longer about wealth or class. It was about belonging. Television, still new and magical, began showing advertisements that glorified the Italian way of drinking coffee. Elegant, social, effortless. Brands like Lavazza and Illy became household names not just for taste but for identity. Their posters showed happy faces holding cups, slogans promising energy, unity, and the good life. The coffee bar became a second home, a place to start the day, to rest during work, or to celebrate small victories. The barista, in his white jacket and bow tie, became a neighborhood friend, a listener, a maker of warmth, a craftsman. Coffee had become, without anyone realizing, Italy's social heartbeat. In the golden age of Italian cinema, coffee took its place alongside art, style, and romance. Directors like Federico Fellini, Vittorio De Sica, and Michelangelo Antonioni used cafés as backdrops for human stories. In La Dolce Vita, 1960, Marcello Mastroianni sipped espresso in Roman cafés where dreams and despair mingled in cigarette smoke. In Umberto D. 1952. A lonely pensioner shared a quiet coffee with his dog, a scene that captured both poverty and dignity. In Il Postino, decades later, coffee symbolized simple love and routine, the rhythm of Italian life that never changed. To watch these films was to understand how deeply coffee was woven into Italian identity. The cafe was not merely a place to drink. It was where people existed, where they paused between chaos and calm. Through film, the image of the Italian coffee bar traveled the world. Became romantic, stylish, timeless. Other nations looked at it and saw something beautiful. The art of simplicity, the charm of pause. By the 1960s and 70s, Italian migrants carried their habits across oceans. In New York, Melbourne, Buenos Aires, and Toronto, small Italian cafes began appearing. Modest, warm, filled with the scent of espresso and the sound of clinking cups. At first, these cafes served the Italian community, immigrants who longed for a taste of home. But soon locals discovered them too. The dark, intense espresso was unlike the weak drip coffee they knew. The ritual of standing, sipping, and talking felt new and exciting. From these immigrant cafes, the Italian coffee revolution quietly spread around the world. Espresso machines began to appear in hotels, restaurants, and airports. The Italian style, quick, precise, elegant, became the international symbol of sophistication. In many ways, Italy had given the world a new way to drink, but also a new way to live. Slower, more aware, more connected. As coffee became global, Italian companies began to dominate the market. Lavazza, already a century old, expanded into Europe and beyond. Italy focused on quality and art, producing not just coffee but porcelain cups designed by famous painters. Gaggia and Fima built espresso machines that stood in cafes from Paris to Tokyo. Each brand carried a story, a blend of craftsmanship, family, and design. To own an Italian machine was to own a piece of culture. The curves of chrome, the hiss of steam, the thick crema, they all spoke of Italy's devotion to beauty and precision. In offices, homes, and city squares across the world, people were beginning to experience the same thing Italians had known for centuries. That coffee was more than drink. It was ritual, connection, and art. By the 1970s, coffee had become the silent conductor of the Italian day. The rhythm was always the same. At dawn, the streets filled with the aroma of freshly ground beans. Men read newspapers folded neatly in half. Women adjusted scarves. Baristas polished the counters. The first uncafé of the day was short and strong. An awakening. Mid-morning brought cappuccino. Always before noon, never after. Lunch might end with another espresso, small but essential to reset the mind. In the afternoon, a macchiato perhaps, for a gentle lift. And after dinner, one last café. Dark, pure, unadorned. This rhythm, unchanged for decades, defined the Italian relationship with time. Coffee was not about rush. It was about the pause between things, the breath before life moved forward again. While espresso ruled the bars, the mocha pot ruled the home. Generations grew up to its familiar sound, the bubbling sigh as coffee rose through the chambers, the faint hiss as it finished. It was the music of morning, of family, of comfort. In small apartments, mothers poured coffee into tiny cups while sunlight touched the tiled floors. The smell drifted out of windows into narrow streets, mixing with the sound of church bells and bicycle wheels. For Italians abroad, the mocha became a keepsake, a memory they could carry. Wherever they went, they packed it carefully, along with a small bag of ground coffee from home. In its simple shape, the mocha expressed what Italy's coffee culture had always been about: beauty in function, joy in ritual, warmth in the ordinary. By the late 1970s and 1980s, the world was changing fast. Technology, design, and globalization were reshaping everything, even how people drank coffee. And once again, Italy was quietly leading the transformation. Italian espresso machines, once heavy and mechanical, began to evolve into works of art. Companies like Fima, Gaggia, and La Marzocco perfected machines that combined craftsmanship with modern engineering. Chrome gleamed like jewelry. levers moved with elegance, and pressure gauges ticked like precise clocks. These machines began to appear in cities from Tokyo to San Francisco. Wherever they went, they carried a piece of Italian philosophy, that a single cup of coffee deserved the same attention as a painting or a poem. This was the era when espresso became global language, a symbol not of luxury, but of refinement, an everyday ritual elevated by art. In the early 1980s, an American businessman named Howard Schultz visited Milan. He was fascinated by what he saw, not just the coffee but the experience. In every cafe, people stood shoulder to shoulder, laughing, talking, sharing stories. Coffee wasn't about caffeine. It was about community. When Schultz returned to the United States, he decided to recreate that feeling. He transformed a small coffee company called Starbucks into a global empire, borrowing the Italian idea of espresso bars but blending it with American comfort. Large cups, soft chairs, jazz music, and endless refills. The concept spread like wildfire. Soon, coffee houses across the world were filled with people tapping on laptops, reading or meeting friends. The Italian ritual had evolved into something new, a blend of speed, creativity, and culture. But in Italy, things stayed the same. The traditional cafe remained sacred. No Wi-Fi, no tall cups, no syrups. Just the bar, the cup, and a few minutes of human connection. To the Italians, coffee was still about the pause, not productivity. About presence, not performance. For Italians, watching their coffee culture spread worldwide was both a source of pride and quiet amusement. The rest of the world called it espresso, but for them it was simply cafe. To the Italian, a good cup was never about size or decoration. It was about purity. Freshly ground beans, 25 seconds of extraction, a layer of crema as golden as sunlight. Even as global coffee chains rose, Italy resisted change. No pumpkin spice, no caramel drizzle, no paper cups. The barista still wore a crisp shirt, the espresso still came in porcelain, and people still drank it standing up. In a world racing forward, Italy's refusal to change became a kind of rebellion. A quiet, elegant protest against the chaos of modern life. As Italian style conquered the world through fashion and automobiles, coffee joined the movement. Espresso machines were displayed in design museums. Italy collaborated with contemporary artists to create collectible espresso cups, each one a miniature sculpture. The coffee bar itself became an aesthetic space. Polished marble counters, chrome accents, soft lighting. In Milan and Rome, architects began designing cafes that looked like temples of taste. Meanwhile, brands like Lavazza turned their advertisements into art. They hired legendary photographers like Helmut Newton and Annie Leibovitz to create surreal, sensual coffee imagery. Models wrapped in silk, cups floating in dreamlike settings. Coffee was no longer just a drink. It was Italy's visual signature, a symbol of its timeless relationship with beauty. In the early 2000s, while the world was discovering third-wave coffee, Italy was rediscovering itself. New generations of Italian roasters began blending tradition with innovation. They traveled abroad, learned about different origins, Ethiopian, Colombian, Guatemalan, and brought new ideas home. But they never abandoned their roots. Instead of chasing trends, they refined their craft. Lighter roasts, sustainable sourcing, and a return to the artistry of brewing. Small specialty cafes began to appear in Florence, Naples, and Turin. Here, baristas spoke of flavor notes, aroma balance, and bean terroir, not as science but as poetry. The result was an elegant evolution. The same Italian soul, newly aware of the world beyond. In 2019, Italy officially nominated its espresso culture for recognition by UNESCO as part of the world's intangible heritage. The proposal described espresso not as a beverage, but as a ritual that defines identity, sociability, and artistry. It explained that drinking coffee in Italy is never passive. It is an act of belonging. Each sip connects generations, neighborhoods, and emotions. When Italians heard that the world might recognize their humble espresso as a global treasure, they smiled, not out of pride but affection, because for them it had always been sacred. Perhaps the greatest lesson Italy offered the world wasn't in beans or machines, but in tempo, the rhythm of life. While other countries measured success in speed, Italy measured it in savor. An espresso wasn't meant to be taken away. It was meant to anchor a moment. In an age of digital noise, this became its quiet power. To stop for a coffee was to stop the world for 30 seconds. To breathe, to think, to exist. And so, in the chaos of globalization, the Italian coffee ritual survived. Unchanged, unhurried, unbeatable. Today, Milan stands as a paradox. Ultra-modern yet traditional, global yet deeply Italian. Skyscrapers rise beside ancient cathedrals, and in their shadows, people still crowd around tiny bars for their morning cafe. A businessman in an Armani suit takes his espresso next to a taxi driver in uniform. The barista knows them both. There is no hierarchy, no rush. Just the warm hum of conversation, the scent of roasted beans, and the clinking of cups. The same sounds heard a century ago. Every morning across Italy, this ritual repeats itself. Unchanged, eternal, serene. Italy may have invented espresso, but what it truly gave the world was ritual. A way to find grace in the ordinary. From the mocha pot in a grandmother's kitchen to the gleaming machines of Milan, from the smoky cafés of Rome to the global chains of New York, it is all one story. Of connection, design, and pause. For the world, Italian coffee became a taste. For Italians, it remains a heartbeat. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Italian café had become something more than a place for refreshment. It had become a stage for the mind. Within these smoky, candlelit rooms, ideas moved faster than the spoons stirring espresso. In cities like Turin, Milan, Venice, and Florence, cafés transformed into meeting grounds for poets, philosophers, and revolutionaries. The clinking of porcelain cups accompanied whispers of politics, art, and change. Coffee fueled debates that would later shape not only Italy's national identity but also its role in European thought. The espresso was short, but the conversations were endless. Perhaps nowhere captured this better than Café Florian, founded in 1720 under the arcades of St. Mark's Square in Venice. It was not merely a coffee house, it was a reflection of Venice itself. Elegant, mysterious, eternal. In Florian's gilded mirrors, history still watches. Over its tables once sat Lord Byron, Goethe, Charles Dickens, and Casanova himself. Politicians schemed, artists sketched, and travelers gazed at the rain sliding down the old Venetian windows. Café Florian became a sanctuary of silence and sound, a place where Europe's wandering souls found warmth. The scent of roasted beans drifted through the hall, mixing with the faint perfume of tobacco and damp marble. Even today, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the ghostly murmur of 19th-century voices, calm, intellectual, and slightly melancholy, echoing over the music of the lagoon. As Italy moved toward unification in the 19th century, a struggle known as the Risorgimento, cafés played a hidden but powerful role. In Turin's Café Fiorio, young men whispered plans for freedom. Among them sat Camillo Cavour, who would later become one of Italy's founding statesmen. His table, tucked into the corner of the café, became known as the minister's seat. Here politics and caffeine mixed freely. Letters were exchanged, manifestos drafted, alliances formed, all beneath the soft clatter of cups and saucers. The Austrian authorities, who ruled parts of northern Italy, called these places nests of conspiracy. And they were right. Ideas were brewing there stronger than any espresso. Coffee houses gave people a place to speak safely, a rare luxury in an era of censorship. They became the classrooms of a new Italy, open to anyone who could afford a cup. Every Italian city developed its own coffeehouse personality. In Florence, cafés leaned toward art and philosophy. In Rome, they hummed with clerics, diplomats, and writers. In Milan, they pulsed with industrial ambition. And yet, they all shared one soul, the rhythm of slow conversation. Unlike the frantic energy of London's coffeehouses or the smoky rebellion of Parisian cafés, Italy's were measured and graceful. There was patience in every gesture, in the barista's steady pour, in the reader's quiet turning of a newspaper page, in the simple pleasure of existing among strangers. To an outsider, nothing seemed to happen. But in truth, everything was happening, quietly. The 19th and early 20th centuries saw Italian literature flourish beside the hum of espresso machines. Gabriele D'Annunzio, the decadent poet of Italy's modern age, was known to compose verses in cafés. His notebook filled with the smell of coffee and ink. Italo Svevo in Trieste, Luigi Pirandello in Rome, and Umberto Saba, each found in cafés not just caffeine but company for thought. Even the modern philosopher Umberto Eco once said that Italian cafés preserved a ritual of logic, a space where observation, reflection, and storytelling intertwined like the swirls in a cup of cappuccino. For Italian thinkers, coffee houses were not about escape. They were about awareness. No Italian city embodies this spirit more than Trieste, the northern port city once part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Trieste became Europe's coffee capital in the 19th century, a gateway for beans arriving from Africa and Asia. It was here that the Illy Company was born in 1933, refining the art of espresso technology. But long before that, Trieste's cafés were alive with writers and dreamers. At Café San Marco, the great author James Joyce wrote parts of Ulysses while teaching English to local students. Around him, Italians, Slovenes, and Austrians argued politics in a dozen languages. Trieste cafés became small worlds of culture, cosmopolitan yet intimate, sophisticated yet human. Each cup served there carried a trace of empire, migration, and memory. Italy's coffeehouse culture inspired movements beyond its borders. During the Enlightenment, the Italian model influenced European intellectual life, from Vienna's grand cafés to Budapest's smoky parlors. Wherever coffee went, freedom of thought followed. In the dim light of these cafés, discussions about democracy, philosophy, and art continued long after midnight. Coffee gave people both warmth and wakefulness, the courage to question. In that sense, Italy's true export was not coffee itself, but the habit of reflection, the quiet revolution of the mind that spread cup by cup across Europe. Today, many of these historic cafés still stand. Some are grand tourist destinations. Others remain unchanged, their tables scarred by time, their mirrors faded by candle smoke. To sit in one of them is to step outside time. The marble may be cracked, the waiter may move slowly, but the soul of the place remains intact, a living museum of conversation. The walls remember. They have seen revolution, romance, betrayal, laughter, and long silences. Each coffeehouse holds centuries within its scent, a blend of roasted beans and human thought. When we think of revolutions, we imagine battlefields and banners. But Italy taught the world that some revolutions begin quietly, with two people leaning over a small round table, a cup between them, and an idea that refuses to fade. The sleepy revolution, indeed, was never about noise. It was about awakening, one mind at a time, one sip at a time. And in those hushed cafés, where the only sounds were cups clinking and pens scratching across paper, the future slowly took shape. As the new century unfolded, Italy stood on the edge of promise and peril. Its cities glittered with new inventions, trams, telephones, electric lights, yet its countryside remained poor and restless. Still, in every alleyway and square, one ritual continued unbroken: the morning cup of coffee. The aroma of roasted beans drifted from small cafés as if defying the tension in the air. In those fragile years, coffee became something more than a drink. It became a symbol of stability, a bridge between old and new worlds. For the working class, it was a comfort after long shifts in factories. For the intellectuals, a fuel for thought. And for the nation itself, young, ambitious, and uncertain, coffee was a quiet reassurance that daily life, at least, still had rhythm. When the Great War erupted in 1914, coffee imports were disrupted. Ships carrying beans from distant colonies were diverted or destroyed. Italy, like much of Europe, faced shortages. Cafés stayed open, but their cups grew lighter. People began drinking surrogati, substitutes made from roasted barley, chicory, or acorns. The taste was bitter, the color dull, but Italians still gathered. They clinked their tiny cups in solidarity, pretending not to notice the difference. In trenches, soldiers boiled makeshift brews over small fires, calling it café de guerre. Even the weakest imitation reminded them of home. It became part of morale, a sip of normalcy amid chaos. Letters from the front mention it again and again. "We had coffee this morning, it almost felt like peace." After the war, Italy stumbled into a new and darker era. The 1920s saw the rise of Benito Mussolini and his fascist regime. Nationalism colored every part of daily life, even coffee. The government launched propaganda campaigns promoting self-sufficiency. Imports were expensive, and colonial ambitions in Africa were framed as a way to secure Italy's own coffee empire. The slogan "autarkia," economic independence, appeared even in cafés. Roasters were ordered to blend imported coffee with homegrown substitutes from Eritrea or Libya. Baristas complied, though quietly they complained that the aroma of empire could never replace the real beans from Brazil or Ethiopia. Still, cafés remained spaces of subtle rebellion. Behind polite chatter, people exchanged forbidden newspapers, whispered anti-regime jokes, and spoke carefully of freedom. The espresso machine, invented only a few decades earlier, now stood as a silent witness, hissing softly as Italy balanced between control and creativity. When World War II began, the smell of roasted coffee nearly vanished from Italy's streets. Trade collapsed once more. The Allies blockaded shipping routes, and what little coffee remained went to the military or black markets. Families brewed café di cicoria, chicory coffee, or ground chestnuts, wheat, even dried figs. A single spoon of real coffee was treated like treasure, shared among neighbors during holidays. In bombed cities like Naples and Rome, cafés became refuges. People gathered in dim rooms with cracked mirrors and whispered news from the front. The sound of the espresso machine, if one was still working, was like music. Soldiers returning from the front would sometimes be met by baristas who offered them a free cup, thin, watery, but given with warmth. That act, repeated thousands of times, kept hope alive. When the war finally ended in 1945, Italy lay in ruins. Cities were shattered, industries broken, and spirits exhausted. But amid rubble and ration cards, one scent signaled rebirth: the first batches of fresh roasted coffee. Ships from Brazil and Colombia began docking once again in Italian ports. Crowds gathered at docksides, cheering as if old friends had returned. Coffee roasters, long silent, fired up their machines. The first post-war cups were simple: no sugar, little milk, but they tasted of victory. In those early mornings of Reconstruction, Italians lined up outside cafés just to hold something warm again. To many, it wasn't just coffee. It was resilience in liquid form. In 1933, during the height of pre-war hardship, an inventor named Alfonso Bialetti had created a simple, elegant stovetop coffee maker, the Mocha Express. First, it was a novelty, but after the war, as Italy rebuilt, it became a national treasure. With its aluminum body and octagonal shape, the mocha pot allowed every household to brew espresso-like coffee without expensive machines. It was modern, democratic, and beautifully Italian. Women used it in small kitchens. Students carried it to dormitories. Even workers packed it in suitcases when migrating north for jobs. The sound of bubbling mocha coffee became a domestic symphony, a song of renewal. Bialetti's little pot became so iconic that his son Renato later made it a global symbol, printing the mustached Omino con I baffi logo, the little man with a mustache, on every box. In the story of coffee, the Mocha Express wasn't just an invention. It was a revolution that brought espresso home. As Italy entered its economic miracle of the 1950s, the country's cafés filled once more with laughter. Coffee became part of pop culture, immortalized in film and music. Actors like Marcello Mastroianni and Sophia Loren sipped espresso on screen. The act itself became sensual, stylish, cinematic. In Federico Fellini's La Dolce Vita, the café was a theater of elegance and fatigue, a place where night never truly ended, only blurred into morning with another espresso. Tourists came from across the world, drawn by the charm of Roman bars and Venetian terraces. To drink coffee in Italy was to feel alive again, part of a post-war world rediscovering beauty. By the late 1950s, coffee had once again become Italy's national heartbeat. It had survived shortages, fascism, war, and occupation, and each time it had returned stronger, more symbolic, more beloved. In its dark liquid shimmered the story of a people who refused to lose their rituals, even in ruin. Each cup held memory, of whispered revolutions, of hardship and hope, of dawns after sleepless nights. And as Italy rebuilt itself into a modern democracy, it carried that same coffee spirit: quiet endurance, daily courage, and the warmth of human connection. In the years after the war, Italy's ruins began to glow with possibility. The streets echoed with hammer blows, trams rattled again, and light returned to darkened piazzas. Amid the reconstruction, the coffee bar rose like a phoenix, polished, bright, and full of life. The new espresso machines, with their chrome curves and glowing lights, became emblems of modernity. Companies such as Gaggia, Fima, and La Pavone redefined Italian design. Their machines hissed and gleamed behind marble counters, symbols of craftsmanship and hope. The post-war bar was more than a café. It was a gathering place, a stage where Italians rehearsed modern life. Workers came at dawn for a quick espresso before their shift. Housewives visited mid-morning to share news and laughter. Students crowded in after classes, their notebooks beside tiny cups. The barista, often dressed in white, became part confidant, part performer, orchestrating the rhythm of daily life with the soft hiss of steam. Between 1950 and 1970, Italy experienced what economists called il miracolo economico, the Italian economic miracle. Factories boomed in the north. Fiat cars rolled out of Turin. Televisions flickered in living rooms for the first time. Yet even as the country industrialized, coffee remained its heartbeat. The espresso bar became the symbol of progress, quick, efficient, and elegant. In the mornings, the factory siren and the espresso machine sang together. One called men to work, the other called them to awaken. The very concept of espresso, fast, concentrated, powerful, mirrored the new Italian spirit. A nation once rooted in agrarian stillness was now running on caffeine and dreams. No other object represented post-war Italian design like the espresso machine. Sleek, functional, and glamorous, it embodied what the world began to call La Bella Macchina, the beautiful machine. Designers such as Achille Costiglione and Ettore Sottsass treated espresso machines as sculptures. They were placed not behind counters but in plain view, glowing like jewels. Even the small, stovetop mocha pot, invented by Alfonso Bialetti decades earlier, became a design icon. Its octagonal form was displayed in museums from Milan to New York, praised as a piece of domestic architecture. Coffee in post-war Italy wasn't just about taste. It was aesthetics, identity, and optimism poured into a cup. The glamour of the espresso bar was immortalized by Italian cinema. In the 1950s and 60s, directors like Federico Fellini, Michelangelo Antonioni, and Vittorio De Sica captured scenes of lovers, artists, and dreamers leaning over counters, lost in thought or laughter. In La Dolce Vita, 1960, the café becomes a metaphor for the seductive rhythm of modern life. Fleeting, dazzling, and slightly melancholic. The camera lingers on the steam rising from cups, the reflections in polished mirrors, the clinking of saucers. Small symphonies of everyday beauty. Actresses like Sophia Loren and Gina Lollobrigida appeared in coffee advertisements, their elegance turning espresso into a form of romance. To drink coffee was to participate in a national performance. Graceful, alert, confident. As Italy urbanized, the bar replaced the town square as the meeting point of society. It was democratic. Everyone stood at the same counter, paid the same price, drank from the same porcelain cup. There were unspoken rules, traditions carried like rituals. Never linger too long at the counter. Never order cappuccino after 11 a.m. Always greet the barista with respect. Always savor the aroma before the first sip. These rules were not written, but understood, part of Italy's silent civility. In a country rebuilding its identity, these rituals offered something unchanging. Every espresso served was a small reassurance that the nation still knew who it was. The 1950s also brought quiet social change. As women entered the workforce, the coffee bar became a space of independence. Once considered a male domain, cafés began to welcome women not as guests but as equals. They could meet friends, discuss work, or simply take a pause between errands. The simple act of ordering a coffee alone became a subtle expression of autonomy. Advertisements reflected this shift. Women were shown confidently holding espresso cups, smiling in the soft light of modern kitchens. The domestic mocha pot became not just a household tool but a symbol of female agency, a way to craft sophistication within everyday life. By the late 1960s, Italy's espresso culture began to spill across borders. Italian emigrants carried their rituals abroad, to London, New York, Buenos Aires, and Sydney. Italian coffee brands such as Illy, Lavazza, and Kimbo became ambassadors of national pride. Each exported not only beans but a philosophy, that coffee was not just consumed but experienced. Abroad, the espresso bar was exotic, stylish, and slightly mysterious. Foreigners tried to replicate it but rarely captured its rhythm. The swift service, the unspoken intimacy, the sense of community that existed only at a real Italian bank one. Soon, European capitals filled with imitation Italian bars. And yet Italians themselves remained indifferent. To them, espresso abroad was like opera sung in translation, recognizable but never the same. The advertising boom of the 1960s turned coffee into a symbol of aspiration. Lavazza's playful posters showed glamorous figures waking joyfully to their morning espresso, while television commercials filled homes with laughter and charm. The coffee break became a cultural moment, short, spontaneous, and perfectly timed. It wasn't merely about consumption but about connection, a pause within progress. And as Italy's economy soared, coffee anchored its humanity, a small, familiar ritual amid the glitter of modernization. Through all this change, one figure remained constant: the barista. Equal parts craftsman and confidant, the barista held the city's pulse in his hands. In the early morning rush, his movements were poetry. The quick spin of the portafilter, the measured press of the tamper, the flick of the wrist releasing perfect crema. People trusted him not only to make their coffee right but to start their day right. He knew who took sugar, who didn't, who was running late, who had lost a job, who had fallen in love. In a nation rebuilding from ashes, he became something sacred, the quiet guardian of continuity. By the early 1970s, Italy's skyline shimmered with modern glass, but beneath it all, the scent of roasted beans still defined the air. Espresso was no longer a luxury or necessity, it was identity. It told the story of how a country could rise from despair with elegance, how it could industrialize without losing its soul. From humble bars in working-class districts to chic cafés on Roman boulevards, Italy's sleepy revolution, its gentle awakening through coffee, was complete. And as trains sped through new highways and television-filled homes, one thing remained beautifully unchanged: the sound of an espresso machine releasing a breath of steam, marking the quiet heartbeat of modern Italy. By the 1970s, Italy had already mastered the art of coffee as ritual. But another transformation was taking place. Deeper, quieter, almost invisible. Coffee had become not merely a drink or a habit but a vessel of reflection, a way to think, to debate, and to dream. In cities like Florence, Rome, and Bologna, coffee houses turned into open classrooms, where voices of writers, artists, and students blended with the soft hum of espresso machines. The bar became a democratic salon. One could enter with nothing but a few coins, yet leave having absorbed philosophy, politics, and poetry. It was here that Italy's intellectual heartbeat grew stronger, sustained by caffeine and conversation. Long before social media, long before even television dominated minds, the coffee bar was the original Italian forum, a space for debate, gossip, and philosophy. In the smoky corners of Turin's Barotti and Milano or Rome's Café Greco, customers argued about art, literature, and the future of Europe. Professors from the University of Bologna met their students for espresso-fueled discussions about Marx, Dante, and Fellini. The espresso cup, small but strong, became a metaphor for intensity, a shot of thought condensed into liquid form. One sip, and one's mind awoke. In Milan, the intellectually, journalists, designers, and filmmakers gathered daily. Their ideas shaped magazines, films, and even the politics of the time. The bar was their stage, the saucer their notepad. The connection between coffee and conversation wasn't new. Italy had inherited it from centuries before. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the first cafés of Venice and Turin mirrored the Enlightenment coffeehouses of Paris and London. They were places of liberal thought and civil discourse, where ideas about democracy, art, and humanism were brewed alongside steaming cups. Now, in the 20th century, this heritage reawakened. Italy's modern thinkers found themselves part of an old lineage, one that stretched from Voltaire's Paris to Vivaldi's Venice, from candlelit discussions to neon-lit espresso bars. Each era had its drink, but only Italy gave that drink a soul. Writers and poets across Italy confessed to their dependency on coffee, not as an addiction, but as a muse. The novelist Italo Calvino once wrote that coffee sharpened the mind, like a blade that never dulls. The poet Eugenio Montale, sitting at his usual café in Liguria, would stir his espresso slowly before penning verses that seemed to smell faintly of roasted beans. Even journalists relied on the ritual. At dawn, as newspaper presses began to roll, editors gathered around a bar for their first shot of clarity. Headlines were discussed over cups, political scandals debated over crema and steam. For them, the sound of an espresso machine was as vital as the rustle of paper, both signals that the world was awake. In Italy, coffee shaped not only energy but rhythm. The country's very style of speaking, animated, fast, expressive, mirrored the espresso itself. Quick, strong, concentrated. A conversation at a coffee bar was never static. Voices rose and fell, hands gestured, laughter echoed. Ideas collided like cups on marble. Yet beneath all that energy, there was grace, a shared understanding that debate, like coffee, should always end sweetly. The espresso counter was a leveler of class. A mechanic could argue with a professor, a student with a politician, all with equal right to be heard. There was no entrance fee, no hierarchy, only the price of a single cup. That equality made the bar a sacred Italian institution, a place where everyone could belong. As urban life quickened, coffee bars also became spaces of observation, miniature theaters of daily existence. In Rome, people watching became an art. At Sant'Eustachio il Café, near the Pantheon, intellectuals and travelers sat quietly, observing the stream of humanity. Priests, artists, tourists, beggars, all converging for their morning ritual. For some, coffee provided not stimulation but stillness, a pause in the rush of life, a moment to look, to think, to remember. The historian Indro Montanelli once described the Italian bar as the last refuge of thought before the world begins shouting. And in many ways that was true. The bar was both chaos and calm, a perfect equilibrium of motion and silence, of solitude within company. The 1970s were not peaceful years in Italy. The Anni di Piombo, the years of lead, brought social unrest, political violence, and fear. Yet even amid this turbulence, the coffee bar endured as a symbol of normalcy and community. When news of bombings or strikes spread, people didn't turn on their televisions first. They went to their local bar. They gathered, discussed, and tried to make sense of the madness together, one espresso at a time. The barista's machine still hissed, steam still rose, and cups still clinked, small defiant gestures of continuity. In a divided nation, the act of standing shoulder to shoulder at the counter, drinking the same bitter liquid, was quietly unifying. Meanwhile, Italian emigrants in cities like New York, Toronto, and Melbourne recreated their homeland through coffee. They opened small cafés, sometimes called espresso bars, sometimes cafeterias, and decorated them with pictures of Rome, Naples, or Sicily. The sound of the espresso machine, the scent of beans, the friendly chow. of the barista became a link to everything left behind. To immigrants, coffee wasn't just a drink. It was belonging in exile. And gradually, non-Italians began to adopt the culture. They learned to stand at the bar, to sip instead of gulp, to enjoy the stillness between sips. In these quiet exchanges, Italy taught the world the subtle art of slowing down. By the late 20th century, espresso had come to embody more than a beverage. It was a philosophy, one of elegance, precision, and presence. To make an espresso properly demanded attention, patience, and respect for process, the same virtues Italy had learned in its long history. Each element, water, pressure, grind, temperature, had to align perfectly or the balance was lost. It was alchemy in miniature, a lesson in focus disguised as a morning ritual. The philosopher Umberto Eco once joked that espresso teaches the meaning of being Italian, concentrated, restless, and beautiful. He wasn't entirely joking. Through wars, revolutions, and modernization, Italy's coffee culture had remained steady. It connected generations like an invisible thread, from the merchants of Venice to the students of Bologna, from Renaissance scholars to modern baristas. Coffee had shaped not just Italy's mornings, but its mindset, the way it thought, created, and connected. And though globalization loomed, though instant coffee and multinational chains threatened authenticity, the small Italian bar remained unshaken, a microcosm of the nation's soul, protected by the quiet hiss of steam. By the 1980s, the fragrance of Italian espresso had begun to drift far beyond the piazzas and cobbled alleys of Italy. What had once been a quiet national ritual was now becoming a worldwide fascination. Travelers returning from Rome or Milan carried stories of tiny cups, creamy foam, and the elegant rhythm of Italian cafés. For the first time, the world saw coffee not merely as a drink, but as an experience, something layered with atmosphere, design, and emotion. Tourists who had once stood at Roman counters found themselves craving that same moment of perfection back home, the hiss of steam, the clink of porcelain, the friendly buongiorno that felt like sunlight. And so, the espresso began its second revolution, no longer confined to Italy, but traveling outward as a quiet ambassador of Italian culture. Italian espresso machines, once found only in local bars, started appearing across Europe and America. Brands such as Fima, La Marzocco, and Rancilio became status symbols for coffee houses abroad. In Paris, London, and New York, sleek chrome machines gleamed behind counters, promising a taste of the dolce vita. But something changed in translation. Outside Italy, the ritual slowed down. People sat for hours with large cups, reading or typing, while in Italy, espresso remained an act of focus and brevity. A moment, not a mood. Still, for many foreigners, the espresso bar was a revelation. The idea that a single sip could hold such intensity, such beauty, reshaped how the world thought about coffee. The Italian bar had become global, but its soul remained tied to the small streets of Naples, Turin, and Florence. While espresso was the Italian heart, cappuccino was the face the world fell in love with. Its creamy layer of froth, dusted with cocoa, felt more approachable to new drinkers. The name itself, cappuccino, carried an old-world mystery, derived from the brown robes of Capuchin monks. In the 1980s and 90s, cappuccino became a cultural symbol. In London, it replaced tea for many. In New York, it became part of urban identity. In Japan, it represented sophistication and cosmopolitan taste. Italy watched this global obsession with quiet amusement. For Italians, cappuccino was strictly a morning drink, something enjoyed before 11 a.m., never after lunch. Yet abroad, people drank it all day, often with syrups and creams that made Italians raise an eyebrow. The drink had changed, but its origin, its name, its idea, still whispered of Italian mornings, of sunlit kitchens, and of the first comforting sip of the day. By the late 1990s, the coffee world shifted again. American chains began to dominate, turning coffee into a global industry. Companies like Starbucks built their image on Italian aesthetics. Marble counters, espresso terminology, Italian words like grande and macchiato appearing on menus around the world. But to Italians, this was something strange. Coffee, for them, had never been about branding or size. It was about precision, proximity, and pride. It belonged to the corner bar, not to a corporate empire. In Milan or Rome, one could still find a perfectly made espresso for €1. Meanwhile, abroad, people stood in long lines and paid 5 times more for a paper cup filled with milk and sugar. Italians were proud, sometimes stubbornly so. They didn't adapt to the global model. They resisted it. And in that resistance, they preserved something precious. The simplicity of coffee as a human exchange, not a commodity. Even as global coffee chains conquered continents, Italian bars remained unchanged. In Rome, baristas still remembered each customer's order by heart. In Naples, they still served espresso so thick and fragrant that it coated the tongue with warmth. In Venice, the sound of spoons against porcelain still echoed under frescoed ceilings. Some traditions even grew stronger. The café Espresso, the suspended coffee, a practice born in Naples, returned in popularity. A customer could pay for 2 coffees, leaving one in suspension for someone who could not afford it. This simple act captured everything the modern coffee empire had forgotten: solidarity, kindness, and humility. While multinational coffee culture turned cafés into brands, Italy quietly kept its bars as living rooms of the nation. Movies continued to romanticize Italy's coffee ritual. From Roman Holiday to the talented Mr. Ripley, espresso cups appeared as symbols of taste and intimacy. Directors loved the visual poetry. A cup on a marble table, a silver spoon glinting in sunlight, steam rising as characters exchanged glances. These scenes told the world what Italians already knew. Coffee wasn't just fuel. It was a moment of connection, a language of its own. In this way, cinema became Italy's silent ally, preserving the aesthetic of the espresso experience, even as globalization diluted its authenticity. As the 2000s approached, a quiet counter-movement began within Italy. Younger generations of baristas, inspired by both tradition and experimentation, started exploring coffee as art once again. They studied roasting profiles, bean origins, and water chemistry. Cafés in Milan and Florence began offering single-origin espressos, brewed with meticulous care. It was a return to roots, but also a step forward. A way of saying that authenticity could coexist with innovation. In Naples, some cafés reintroduced traditional lever machines, preferring the rhythm of manual brewing to automatic pumps. The barista became a storyteller again, explaining the bean's origin, the roast, the pressure, the flavor notes, much like a sommelier describing wine. Italy had rediscovered the soul of its own revolution. As globalization blurred cultures, Italy clung gently to its morning ritual. In a world of screens and speed, the act of stepping into a bar, resting one's hand on the counter, and exchanging a few words with a barista remained profoundly human. It was an act of grounding, a daily reaffirmation of community and continuity. Young Italians, though influenced by global trends, still carried the habit in their blood. They might check their phones between sips, but they still ordered standing, still drank quickly, still nodded politely before leaving. Because in Italy, espresso was never just caffeine, it was character. By the dawn of the 21st century, nearly every city in the world had some version of an Italian café. But only in Italy did the essence remain unchanged. The warmth of the marble counter, the clatter of cups, the soft murmur of conversation. From Tokyo to Toronto, people tried to recreate that feeling. Some succeeded, some did not. But all, knowingly or not, were participating in Italy's sleepy revolution. The transformation of a simple bean into a cultural symbol of connection, care, and craft. Italy had not conquered the world through armies or empires this time. It had done so gently, through aroma and ritual. The world drank Italian coffee and, perhaps without realizing it, adopted a piece of Italian philosophy. That life, like espresso, should be savored, short, strong, and full of meaning. There is a moment, somewhere between dawn and daylight, when Italy breathes in. Curtains flutter. Church bells stir the air. And then, softly, the smell of coffee fills the room. That aroma, familiar, warm, slightly bitter, has lived in Italian memory for generations. It is the scent of childhood mornings, of mothers at the stove with a small aluminum mocha pot, of fathers reading the paper at the kitchen table. For most Italians, coffee is not just a beverage. It is memory distilled into taste. Each cup carries echoes of laughter, arguments, and quiet pauses shared across decades. It is the smell of routine that never tires. The same sound of bubbling coffee that once lulled a child awake now comforts the same person grown old. In every Italian household, the Bialetti mocha pot sits like a family relic. Sturdy, simple, eternal. Invented in 1933, it became the heart of domestic ritual. The process itself is an unspoken prayer. Fill the bottom chamber with water, scoop in the ground coffee, twist it tight, place it on the stove, and wait for the gentle gurgle. That gurgle, the rising, steady rhythm of pressure and steam, became the soundtrack of countless mornings. For children, it meant their parents were awake. For adults, it meant the world was in order. Even in an age of electric machines and capsules, the mocha's voice persists, the nostalgic hum that connects past to present. It is, perhaps, the most intimate piece of Italian design ever made. A machine that speaks. In Italian families, the ritual of coffee often revolves around the mother. She is the keeper of taste, the one who decides how strong, how sweet, how full-bodied it should be. For her, coffee is both offering and care. She pours it for guests before asking how they are. She places it before her husband when words aren't needed. She teaches her children how to brew it just right. Not too bitter, not too thin. In those gestures, she preserves a nation's emotional heritage. Because coffee in Italy is not served, it is shared. It is her way of saying, "You are home." While morning espresso belongs to energy and purpose, the afternoon cafe belongs to stillness. Shutters half closed, sunlight slanting across tiled floors, an old radio murmuring softly, and on the table, a small cup cooling beside a plate of biscuits. This is Italy's sacred silence. Time to pause, to reflect, to breathe. Older Italians often describe their afternoon coffee as a conversation with oneself, a moment to measure the day, to feel grateful for its rhythm. Even in bustling cities like Milan or Naples, somewhere behind a curtain or on a quiet balcony, this ritual continues. Small, invisible, and enduring. Italians speak often of assenza, absence, and coffee carries that emotion gently. When someone is gone, a parent, a lover, a friend, their coffee cup remains, sometimes untouched on a shelf. The ritual continues, quietly honoring them. A widow may still prepare 2 espressos every morning. A son might still visit the same bar where his father once stood. In this repetition lies comfort, a bridge between what was and what remains. Because grief, like coffee, is strongest when shared in silence. Walk through any Italian city in the morning, and you'll smell it. The soft, drifting perfume of roasted beans escaping from cafés. It mixes with the scent of rain on stone, with bakery air and cigarette smoke, creating something uniquely Italian, a fragrance of living. In Rome, you can follow it like a trail, from the cobbled Trastevere lanes to the glowing bars near Piazza Navona. In Naples, the aroma pours out of alleyways, mingling with sea breeze and frying oil. It's more than smell, it's orientation. The scent of coffee tells you where you are, and reminds you that you belong. Italian coffee is complex, not only in flavor but in feeling. The bitterness of espresso mirrors life's struggles. The sweetness of sugar softens them. The foam of cappuccino recalls youth, the strength of ristretto speaks of endurance, and the lingering aftertaste, that faint, smoky finish, reminds one of time passing, of moments fading like the last warmth in the cup. This is why Italians never gulp coffee. They savor. Because every sip carries something human. Joy, fatigue, love, or loss. And to drink carelessly would be to lose meaning. Few things express friendship in Italy as naturally as the words, "Ti offro un caffè." I'll buy you a coffee. It's a small gesture, but one heavy with care. Means sit with me. Means let's talk. A single cup can dissolve tension, spark laughter, or seal forgiveness. Lovers reconcile over espresso. Old friends reunite after years. Even business rivals lower their guard at the bar, their hands warming over porcelain. Coffee, in its smallness, holds a large humanity. For Italians who live abroad, coffee is the ache of nostalgia. They can find good espresso anywhere now. Machines are global, beans are imported, but the feeling is not the same. Something is missing. The familiar clatter, the quick nod of the barista, the rhythm of voices speaking Italian all around. So when they return home, the first thing they seek is not family or landmarks. It's that first real espresso at the airport bar. One sip, and suddenly everything returns. Childhood, sunlight, language, belonging. That's the quiet power of Italian coffee. It collapses distance, erases years. Writers often say that in Italy, coffee is a form of poetry. Short, rhythmic, intense. The philosopher Giorgio Agamben once wrote that the espresso cup is a miniature theater of life, where bitterness and sweetness meet in the same small space. Indeed, the cup itself has become symbolic. White porcelain, smooth and curved, designed for no other purpose but that one sacred act. The saucer beneath it is not merely practical. It's ceremonial, completing the symmetry. The spoon, resting quietly, invites reflection. Even the act of stirring becomes meditative, a swirl of warmth and patience. To watch an Italian stir their coffee is to glimpse how they live, with grace, deliberation, and presence. Some say Italy speaks 3 languages: Italian, gesture, and coffee. The way one orders, holds, drinks. Each says something about who they are. A quick espresso at the counter marks decisiveness. A slow cappuccino at a cafe window hints at contemplation. A macchiato signals balance, strength with a touch of gentleness. Every order tells a story. Through coffee, Italians express themselves without words. It's a small ritual that translates emotion into action, from greeting to gratitude, from thought to affection. And that, more than any empire or invention, may be Italy's greatest gift to the world. A language spoken in aroma and silence. As the 18th century reached its height, Italy was caught in the slow, simmering pulse of change. While the courts and cathedrals continued to define much of its grandeur, beneath the marble ceilings and frescoed chapels, a new kind of power was stirring, one not bound by crowns or clergy, but by conversation and caffeine. The humble coffee house, once a curious import from the East, had transformed into a chamber of thought, a crucible for the revolution of ideas. In Venice, the Café Florian remained the jewel of the Piazza San Marco, its mirrors reflecting powdered wigs, quills, and the glimmer of candlelight on porcelain cups. Here, philosophers and poets debated Voltaire's wit and Newton's laws. It was said that if you sat long enough in Florian, you could hear the world changing around you, one slow, deliberate sip at a time. Rome, always proud of its spiritual and political gravitas, began to see its own version of this transformation. The Café Greco, with its orange walls and shadowed corners, became the haunt of artists, sculptors, and travelers. Goethe, Casanova, and Keats would one day leave whispers of their words behind its narrow tables. The smell of roasted beans mingled with the scent of ink and parchment, creating a perfume of both intellect and indulgence. But perhaps most transformative of all was how coffee itself began to erode the boundaries of class. Once an indulgence of the elite, it trickled downward into the hands of merchants, scholars, and eventually common workers. The act of drinking coffee became less about status, and more about awakening, the daily ritual of clarity and connection. It was a quiet rebellion, brewed not in the streets, but in porcelain cups. Naples, fiery and alive, was not left untouched. There, coffee became a symbol of life's intensity. Vendors carried copper pots through the alleys, offering cups of scalding, syrupy espresso to anyone in need of warmth or courage. In the crowded piazzas, amid the shouting of fishmongers and the clatter of carts, coffee was the heartbeat, a short, strong affirmation of life itself. As Enlightenment ideals began to ripple across Europe, these Italian cafés became the unseen laboratories of democracy. The same places where scholars once debated theology now buzzed with talk of liberty and reason, ideas that would one day shape modern Italy. the seeds of unity, progress, and national identity, were often first whispered over the gentle hiss of steaming kettles. And through it all, the drink retained its quiet mystery. The beans still came from distant lands, carried across seas by traders and smugglers. The process, roasting, grinding, brewing, remained half art, half alchemy. Coffee was, in every sense, a bridge. Between east and west, between night and morning, between silence and speech. In the back rooms of Florence and the candlelit chambers of Turin, reformers gathered with their notebooks, while nearby, the common folk sat with the same dark liquid, perhaps unaware that their cups were filled with revolution. The equality that eluded politics found its first taste here, in the shared warmth of coffee. The more people drank, the more they thought. And the more they thought, the more they questioned. Kings ruled from marble halls, but the pulse of Italy began to beat in small rooms filled with laughter, smoke, and the hum of caffeinated dreams. And so, as the century turned, the stage was quietly set for something larger, something that would one day shape the nation itself. The revolution had not yet arrived, but the aroma was already in the air. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Italian peninsula was a map divided not by rivers or mountains, but by politics. Kingdoms, duchies, and foreign powers tugged at its borders like threads in a frayed tapestry. The spirit of Italy, fractured, multilingual, and regional, yearned for something greater, unification. And quietly, beneath the banners of kings and rebels, coffee became the unseen companion of revolution. In the small cafés of Milan and Turin, whispers grew into words, and words into plans. The Risorgimento, Italy's long awakening, was not forged only on the battlefield but in the gentle rhythm of spoons against porcelain. The thinkers of the movement, men like Giuseppe Mazzini, found solace and focus in the dark clarity of the drink. Mazzini himself, living much of his life in exile, often wrote of late nights spent drafting letters and manifestos over endless cups of coffee, his candle burning low beside him. The coffee houses became the unofficial offices of rebellion. In Florence, patriots debated the role of monarchy versus republic. In Venice, the merchants plotted ways to undermine Austrian control. In Rome, writers smuggled out pamphlets that spoke of freedom. Between each idea came the comforting pause of another sip, the taste of courage and of hope. Naples, ever fiery in its temperament, brewed coffee that matched its temperament. Bold, thick, unrelenting. The Neapolitan cucum, an inverted metal pot, became the region's signature, a symbol of its defiance against conformity. While armies marched under foreign flags, the people of Naples created their own ritual of independence with every cup they poured. In those restless years, the act of drinking coffee carried a subtle meaning. To share a cup was to share conviction. To gather at a café was to risk suspicion. The Austrian authorities, particularly in the northern territories, viewed coffee houses as dangerous hubs, not because of what was said aloud, but because of what could be imagined there. And yet the aroma spread, unstoppable, intoxicating. Soldiers carried it in their canteens. Poets mentioned it in their verses. Lovers whispered over it in alleyway cafés. It became part of Italy's emotional vocabulary, an unspoken expression of unity. Then came the great wave of struggle, the revolts of 1848, when cities from Milan to Venice erupted in defiance. Cannons thundered through narrow streets while, not far away, in small kitchens, women brewed coffee for their brothers and husbands. The steam rose like prayer, the scent lingering through the smoke of gunpowder. As Garibaldi's red shirts advanced from Sicily northward, liberating one city after another, the common people followed their progress with a mixture of awe and exhaustion. And wherever they went, they carried coffee, the one simple pleasure that remained when bread was scarce and sleep was short. In Palermo, as dawn rose after a night of fighting, an old woman was said to have boiled the last of her beans and served them to wounded men resting on her doorstep. The story became legend, not for its heroism but for its tenderness. The drink symbolized warmth amid chaos, comfort amid collapse. When Italy was finally unified in 1861, under the crown of Victor Emmanuel II, the cafés of the new nation buzzed with pride. Yet there was also melancholy. The dream had been achieved, but at great cost. The coffee served that spring tasted slightly more bitter, perhaps because it reflected the exhaustion of a people who had fought too long to stay divided no more. In Turin, the first parliamentarians gathered to discuss the shape of this new nation. Some of their earliest decrees were not on war or taxation, but on trade. Coffee, once exotic, was now a matter of national importance. Imports from Ethiopia, Yemen, and Brazil became lifelines for the modern Italian economy. Meanwhile, in every small village, cafés began to take root. No longer the preserve of the elite or the rebels, but of everyone. Farmers came in from the fields. Factory workers stopped by before their morning shifts. The dark brew, once a symbol of intellectual rebellion, had become the heartbeat of ordinary life. And yet, its mystery persisted. The same steam that once rose in secret gatherings now floated above every kitchen stove. Italy had awakened, politically, culturally, spiritually, and the scent of coffee was woven into that awakening like smoke in a tapestry. It was said that every revolution leaves behind a new ritual. For Italy, that ritual was simple: a small cup, a brief pause, a quiet reflection. The revolution had ended, but its essence lived on in every sip. The cup that once fueled insurrection now comforted peace. But the next transformation, one that would take coffee from kitchen to counter, from ritual to art, was just beginning. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it a hum, a mechanical heartbeat that echoed through Italy's cobblestone streets. The steam that once rose from copper kettles in quiet cafés now hissed through iron and brass. The age of the espresso had begun. It was in Turin, a city known for its factories and precision, that the transformation first took form. In 1884, an inventor named Angelo Moriondo unveiled a contraption that would forever change the rhythm of coffee. His instantaneous coffee machine used pressurized steam to brew in seconds what once took minutes. Though the device itself remained obscure, it was the spark that would ignite a new Italian obsession: speed. By the 1900s, Luigi Bezzera and Desiderio Pavoni refined Moriondo's design, giving birth to what we now know as the espresso machine. Pavoni's La Pavoni Ideal, unveiled in 1905, stood tall like a brass cathedral in Milan's cafés. Its pipes and gauges gleamed under gaslight, its valves hissing like a living thing. To watch it work was to witness alchemy, beans transformed into rich crema beneath a crown of steam. For Italy, weary from wars and shifting politics, espresso became more than just a drink. It was a declaration of modernity: short, strong, efficient. It fit perfectly into the rhythm of a new world that valued motion over leisure. No longer did one linger for hours in velvet-draped salons. Now, people stood at marble counters, drank quickly, exchanged words or glances, and continued on. Café evolved too. The grand coffeehouses of Venice and Florence gave way to compact espresso bars. Small, bright, and democratic. The barista, standing behind the gleaming machine, became both craftsman and performer. He was the new priest of the people's temple, pulling levers and pouring liquid miracles into porcelain cups. The soundscape of Italy changed with it. The soft murmur of debate was replaced by the rhythmic hum of grinders, the hiss of milk, the clink of saucers. The ritual had become faster but no less sacred. After the devastation of World War I, coffee offered solace once again. Beans were scarce and substitutes, roasted chicory, barley, acorns, filled the void. Yet Italians held on to the memory of true coffee as if it were part of their soul. When the war ended, the return of real beans symbolized not just recovery, but resilience. Then came the 1930s, and with them, an era of design and innovation that would make Italian coffee famous across the globe. In Milan, Achille Gaggia invented the modern espresso machine using a piston mechanism that created higher pressure and thicker crema. It was Gaggia who gave espresso its defining texture, that golden velvety layer that danced atop the cup like sunlight. The word espresso itself, meaning pressed out or express, became a metaphor for the age. Quick, modern, and full of intensity. To drink espresso was to taste the spirit of progress. Cafés once again became meeting places for artists and thinkers, but now their talk was of design, cinema, and fashion. Italy was reinventing itself. Sleek, confident, and beautifully caffeinated. The smell of coffee was everywhere. In train stations, factories, art studios, and newspaper stands. Even in hardship, coffee remained a comfort. During World War II, when rations limited imports, Italians clung to the ritual of brewing, even if it meant improvisation. The moka pot, invented in 1933 by Alfonso Bialetti, became the savior of home coffee. With its octagonal shape and simple aluminum body, it turned every stove into a tiny espresso bar. The moka pot was revolutionary in its own right. It democratized the experience, bringing the flavor of the cafe into every kitchen. Housewives, factory workers, students, all could now participate in Italy's most sacred daily rite. The sound of its bubbling became the soundtrack of mornings across the nation. After the war, the economic boom of the 1950s and 60s propelled coffee culture into a golden age. Cities glittered with neon, cars gleamed on new highways, and in every neighborhood, an espresso bar stood as a symbol of renewal. It was there that men in suits and women in elegant dresses began their days with a tiny cup and a few words exchanged with the barista, a brief human connection amid the rush. Italian coffee had evolved from exotic import to national identity, from secret ritual to daily necessity. Yet it never lost its poetry. Each cup carried within it centuries of memory, of Venetian traders, Florentine thinkers, Neapolitan workers, and the dreamers of the Risorgimento. As Italy's cinema and fashion began to enchant the world, so too did its coffee. Tourists arrived seeking the taste of La Dolce Vita, and found it, steaming in tiny cups across Rome, Milan, and Naples. The espresso machine became an icon of Italian craftsmanship, as recognizable as a Ferrari or Vespa. By the mid-20th century, Italy's coffee culture was not just thriving, it was exporting itself. From London to New York, from Buenos Aires to Tokyo, cafés adopted the Italian model. Words like espresso, latte, and cappuccino became part of global vocabulary. And behind every cup, whether in Milan or Manhattan, lingered the same essence. A bit of Italian warmth, a touch of rebellion, and the aroma of history. But the story was not yet over. Coffee had fueled revolutions, rebuilt cities, and defined generations. Now, in the late 20th century, it would begin its final transformation, from a national ritual to a global symbol. By the late 20th century, Italy's coffee culture had drifted beyond its borders like the faint trace of steam from an open cup. What began as a trade curiosity centuries ago, an Eastern bean carried through Venetian ports, had now become a global phenomenon, steeped in Italian artistry and rhythm. Everywhere, the symbols of this culture spread. The chrome machines, the clinking cups, the quick sip at the bar before the day begins. To walk into a cafe in Buenos Aires, Melbourne, or San Francisco was to catch a glimpse of Italy. Not in its cathedrals or palaces, but in its gestures, its rituals, its warmth. The Italian cafe had become the world's living room. The espresso machine stood proudly at the center of this new empire, its levers and pipes polished like sculpture. Behind it, the barista, that figure of grace and precision, became both artisan and confidant. In Italy, one did not simply order coffee. One shared a moment of trust. The morning espresso, the mid-afternoon macchiato, the late-night decaf, all were part of the gentle choreography of daily life. In the 1980s and 90s, as multinational coffee chains rose around the world, they borrowed not just Italy's beverages, but its spirit. The words on their menus, latte, macchiato, ristretto, spoke Italian even when the customers did not. Each term carried centuries of quiet craftsmanship. And yet, within Italy, the essence remained unchanged. In Rome, men still stood at counters reading newspapers while sipping their single espresso. In Naples, families still debated politics over moka pots on Sunday mornings. In Milan, the rhythm of machines still filled the dawn air. The coffee might be quick, but the experience was eternal. Modern Italy had changed. Its cities faster, its people busier, its mornings brighter. But the act of drinking coffee remained the great equalizer. Whether banker or baker, artist or student, everyone paused, just for that moment, To hold warmth between their hands, breathe deeply, and taste life distilled into a single sip. It was more than caffeine. It was memory, identity, and connection. The heritage of centuries compressed into a ritual that lasted mere seconds. Every espresso pulled was a continuation of a story that began with Venetian merchants and Sufi mystics, with Ottoman traders and Florentine dreamers. From the candlelit cafés of the Renaissance to the roaring espresso bars of the modern age, Italy had taught the world something profound, that even in speed there can be grace, even in routine there can be beauty. And so, the sleepy revolution reached its quiet conclusion, not with noise or conquest, but with the steady hiss of steam and the scent of roasted beans that could make an entire city feel awake. The revolution that coffee brought to Italy was never one of armies or rulers. It was an awakening of minds, of habits, of hearts. Changed how people thought, worked, and even dreamed. From the monks of Venice to the baristas of Milan, the story of coffee was, in truth, the story of Italy's soul learning to open its eyes. Now, as you listen to this story fade, imagine the sound of a quiet Italian morning, the distant ring of church bells, the gentle hiss of steam, the soft clink of porcelain on marble. Breathe in, as though you can smell the faint, earthy sweetness of coffee in the air. Imagine sitting by a small window overlooking a cobblestone street. The first light of dawn paints the walls golden. Somewhere below, a cafe opens its doors, and the city awakens with warmth. Every revolution leaves an echo, and this one hums softly. In every cup poured, every sigh between sips, every moment of pause before the day begins. Close your eyes. Let the warmth of that cup fill you. The centuries of stories, the comfort of tradition, the stillness after the storm of time. Inhale deeply. Exhale slowly. And as the last traces of steam curl into the morning air, drift gently into sleep. Would you like me to now format this entire 15-batch ASMR historical script, 15,000 words, into a complete YouTube voice narration script, with timestamp cues and pacing marks, breathing, pauses, tone direction, ASMR whisper cues, etc., for recording?